All right, so can we agree? I need you guys to talk me down off of something. Can we agree that at this point, nostalgia has reached like an unhealthy point where the bubble's about to pop and it's about to just go everywhere? Nostalgia needs to die. Can we agree that nostalgia needs to die?
Absolutely not.
Okay. This year alone, what do we? You guys have to help me. This year alone, we've seen new Turtles, right? Ninja Turtles from the '90s. We're seeing Independence Day sequel, right? Just this week, I saw they announced they're rebooting the Blair Witch Project. So they're remaking Blair Witch Project. They're making a Lethal Weapon TV show. Just saw a commercial for that this week. New Ghostbusters, which I'm really excited about. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm really stoked on it. Pokemon, okay, listen, if you grew up a nerd like me, Pokemon never went away. Like, I know it had its thing, and then now it seems like it came back, but for some people, it was just there the whole time, and we had to kind of be in the closet about it. And now that it's cool again, we can all jump out and be like, hey, yeah, this new thing. I don't know, can name all 600 now. But, so we're seeing all these things, like, from the past that are now just kind of getting, pardon the expression, regurgitated back out. And most of it is, in all honesty, is a quick cash grab. And I'm guilty. I'm definitely going to go see Ghostbusters. I'm definitely going to see all these things because they were from my childhood, right? And so that's what they do. They're just capitalizing on your nostalgia in order to make a quick buck. And if it's done well, then cool. More power to them. But sometimes those things from your childhood, sometimes they come back. If you go back and look at them, they stand the test of time, and sometimes they really don't. Have you ever gone back and looked at something you loved in your childhood, and you can't realize why? For some reason, it was the best thing when you were a kid, and then now it's on Netflix, and so you go back and you rewatch it, and you're like, this really wasn't. Yeah, Digimon. It just really wasn't what you thought. And I think that can happen a lot. And one thing that has never happened for me is with Dr. Seuss. And so we're starting a new series that's based on Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss was something for me that was a huge part of my childhood. I loved it. And I was talking to my mom about it yesterday, and she reminded me, I didn't know this, but she reminded me that Green Eggs and Ham was actually the first book I learned to read. That was the first book that I could read all the way through. She also reminded me that I read at a remarkably young age, kind of a prodigy, no big deal. And so I think I reminded her of that now that I'm thinking about it. She didn't actually say that. But Green Eggs and Ham was the first book that I learned to read. And so when I think back, and when I go back and look at those, so many things from my childhood, when I go back, they didn't stand the test of time. But Dr. Seuss doesn't qualify. I think you go back to Dr. Seuss, and I still can see everything I loved about it as a kid, I still love as an adult. And so there's something about Dr. Seuss that is cross-generational. You know, it goes and captures the hearts of new generations and new generations and new generations. And so as a former English major, a recovering English major, I can tell you a lot about Dr. Seuss. I can tell you that most of his books, most of his poetry was written in something called anapestic tetrameter, which, it's that rhythm that dot 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 dot. Everything Dr. Seuss dot 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 dot. And as an English major, I can tell you that there's something about that that's pleasing to the brain. And literary critics will say, well, that's why Dr. Seuss, his stuff is so accessible. It's why it's so much fun to read and so much fun to say. And so they'll say, really, that's why every new generation loves it. But when I look back at the stuff that I loved as a kid, I'm not thinking about rhyme scheme. I'm not thinking about, rhythmic meter. I remember Hop on Pop, and I remember Fox and Socks being one of the first books where I learned how to rhyme. And I remember Green Eggs and Ham, again, learning to read there. I remember There's a Walkin' in My Pocket. And I remember my mom gave me a copy of Oh, the Places You'll Go when I graduated high school. And so there's so much more. There's something sentimental that gets to my heart when we talk about Dr. Seuss. So I'm excited to be starting this series off. And we're doing something fun. If you're visiting with us, we don't always do this, but we have planned this with kids so that the same story that we're going to be looking at this morning, your kids are going to be looking at over in Awaken Kids. So it's a great opportunity for when you guys go to lunch afterwards or when you're back home, you can say, oh, well, what did you guys talk about? Oh, we talked about the same thing, and get that conversation going among your family. So we don't do that every series, but we're doing it this whole series. So hopefully that'll be something that gets some cool conversation going around the lunch table and with your family. So we're going to be taking a look at a different story every week. Dr. Seuss, before he became a famous child author, he had some other jobs. He drew for some advertising agencies, and he was a political cartoonist. And I think that that's something that we see carry over into his children's books, is that he made an art form out of communicating a message with his art. It seems like, cool pictures and fun, meters and fun rhymes and fun things that you say, but there's always something deeper going on beneath the cool story and the cool illustrations. And so I think he took that from that political cartoonist into the stories that he wrote. So every week we're going to be taking a story and pulling out some of those great messages from those stories. So the first one we're going to be talking about is one of his lesser known ones. It's not one of the most popular. It's not. We'll be talking about some of those, The Grinch Stole Christmas next week and Green Eggs and Ham the week after. But we're going to start off with one that was not quite as popular. It's a story called Yertle the Turtle. How many of you guys are familiar with Yertle the Turtle? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, it definitely didn't reach the levels of notoriety that some of his other ones did, but it was always one of my favorites. And so we're going to be talking about Yertle the Turtle this morning. So if you're unfamiliar with Yertle the Turtle, the story, it's a short story. It's a part of a collection that he had done, and it takes place in a small pond full of turtles, and Yertle is their king. So Yertle is the king of the turtles. And at the beginning of the story, everything is fantastic. All the turtles are happy. Seuss even goes as far as to say they had everything they could ever need. So there's no problem at the beginning of the book. But then there becomes a problem because suddenly Yertle, the king, something changes and he decides that everything he could ever want or need is not enough. He needs more. And so that's really what starts the story off. Now, I would love to, in all honesty, sit here and just read you the story cover to cover. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that, so I'm only going to be picking and reading certain sections. This is how it starts. And this is the setting that's set. It says, on the faraway island of Salamasand, Yertle the turtle was king of the pond. A nice little pond. It was clean. It was neat. The water was warm. There was plenty to eat. The turtles had everything turtles might need, and they were all happy, quite happy indeed. They were, until Yertle, the king of them all, decided the kingdom he ruled was too small. I'm ruler, said Yertle, of all that I see, but I don't see enough. That's the trouble with me. With this stone for a throne, I look down on my pond, but I cannot look down on the places beyond. This throne that I sit on is too low down. It ought to be higher, he said with a frown. If I could sit high, how much greater I'd be. What a king. I'd be ruler of all that I see. And so Yertle decides, I don't know what gave him this inclination, but he decides that he is the king of everything that he can see. That's how the premise of the story starts. The problem is, if you're familiar with turtles, they're really, really low to the ground. So a turtle can't see very far. Dave, who's our pastor over at Awaken Kids, they have a turtle. I don't know if you guys have ever been to their house. It's like this big box turtle. And we talked about whether or not he was going to bring it in. I wanted to show you guys. And then we talked about whether or not it would be cool just to let it walk around for the whole service, as I preached and stuff. And they ultimately vetoed me on that. They said that wouldn't be a good idea. But they're very low to the ground, and so they can't see very much. And so at the beginning of the story, Yertle's got this little stone, and he's sitting on the stone, but he's dissatisfied because everything that he can see is not very much. And so if you're familiar with the story, the first thing that he does is he decides that he needs to make his throne bigger. And so he starts calling other turtles from the pond. And it starts with 9. He gets 9 turtles together, and he stacks them all on top of each other. And then he climbs to the top. So now instead of sitting on just one little stone, he's got the stone, he's got 9 turtles, and then he's on the top. And so now all of a sudden, he can see quite a bit more. And so he goes from being king of this small little pond and what's in there and a few turtles to now it goes higher. He says, all mine, Yertle cried. Oh, the things I now rule. I'm the king of a cow. I'm the king of a mule. I'm the king of a house, and what's more beyond that, I'm the king of a blueberry bush and a cat. I'm Yertle the turtle, oh marvelous me, for I am the ruler of all that I see. And so we go from the beginning of the story. Yertle, again, clearly states everything he could ever need, he has. But he decides it's not enough. So he stacks up 9 turtles, and now it says in the book he can see almost a mile. And so now he's got all these other things that he's king of: a house, a cow, a mule, a blueberry bush, a cat. And so he's got all these other things that now he's the king of. So one would assume he would now be content, although if you're thinking ahead in the story, you know that's not going to be the case. It'd be a very short story. But as we read through this, the story goes on, and we're going to jump back to it. But I can't help but think of another great storyteller, shameless segue. Jesus also used stories to deliver messages. He didn't speak an anapestic tetrameter, and he didn't rhyme. It'd be really rad if he did, but he didn't. But he would create stories that he would tell that people would relate to in order to convey a message. And so this story in particular of Yertle reminds me of a parable that he told. And so I want us to take a look at that. If you are visiting with us, if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 12. If you don't have one with you, they're going to be on the screen behind me, nice and big. Also, the YouVersion app that we talked about in the welcome, the scriptures will be in there. And if you're here and don't have a Bible this morning, snag one of us on the way out. We'd love to give you one to take with you if you'd like one. But we're going to turn to Luke chapter 12. Luke is one of the books in the Bible that we call the Gospels. It's one of the 4 books that are historical accounts of Jesus' life. So everything we want to hear what Jesus said or did is going to be in one of those Gospels. And so Luke is the 3rd one. We're going to start chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. And so starting in verse 13, this is called the parable of the rich fool. And so this is a story that Jesus was telling. There's thousands of people surrounding him, hearing him teach. And so picking up in verse 13 says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And so immediately they try to involve Jesus in some family squabble that they're having. And I love, shows the humanity of Jesus. Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" In other words, what business is it of mine whether or not he splits his inheritance with you? But he continues on. He says to them in verse 15, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told him this parable in verse 16. It says, "The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods.'" So unpacking this a little bit, he says, I don't have anywhere to store all my crops, but then what does he do afterwards? He tears down his storehouses and his barns and the places that he normally stores his crops. So we get this picture. It wasn't that he had nowhere to put it. It's that he had so much that what he already had was stocked full. He couldn't fit any more there. And so he continues on. He says, "What shall I do? I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, 'You have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?' He says, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." And I think this parable gets used a lot when we talk about generosity, specifically when churches want to talk about money and talk about giving. This passage gets brought up a lot. And I think it's a great passage for that, but I think there's a lot more that we can take from that passage outside of that. And so you have this picture that Jesus paints of it says he's a rich fool. So he's already a man of means. He's already has, like the turtles in the pond, everything he could need. He's got storehouses, barns where he stores all of his surplus grain, and he has so much that they're completely full. And so rather than be content with the full barns and the full storehouses that he already has, he decides, no, I need to get more and more and more and more. And so he decides to tear them down, build bigger ones so that he can fit everything in there. And God says, "You fool, you don't realize you're going to be dead tomorrow," and so none of it mattered. Rather than the opposite of being generous and him being content with what he had and taking the extra that he had and using it to bless other people. And so there's this idea that I think runs through Yertle and runs through this. It's this idea of contentment, right? This idea of being satisfied with what we have. And so that passage is used a lot of times to talk about giving, but I want to take it and I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about this idea of idols. And if you have grown up in the church, you may have one kind of idea. If you haven't grown up in the church, something else may come completely to mind. You might go right to Indiana Jones when we start talking about idols. But idols in the modern sense, I think we want to say an idol is anything that you elevate above God in your life. Anything that comes between you and God, that you put in the position of your life that God should be in, we're going to call that an idol. So anything that you elevate above God is an idol. And in Awaken, we have 4 that we talk about, that we feel like a lot of things come back to these 4 idols, that it's really, really easy to find ourselves chasing after these 4 things instead of what we should be. And the funny thing about an idol is that they're not intrinsically bad. Usually, an idol is something good, but it becomes bad when it gets completely elevated above where it should be, to the point where we are allowing that to rule our life instead of letting God to lead and rule our lives. So the 4 that we talk about, the first one is power. This idea of influence, of being able to have control over other people, of being able to be ambitious, to be successful, this idea of power. Again, not bad things inherently, but if you make that your sole ambition in life and you put it above where God should be in your life, it becomes an idol. So we have power. We have approval. This one is big. Do we have any approval junkies out there? I know we have some. Yeah, I see a few hands, but you didn't want to go up too high because you didn't want anyone to know you're an approval junkie, because then they may not like you. And so that's the downside of being an approval junkie. But yeah, we have this idea of approval, of wanting to be liked, of wanting people to affirm you and to give you your worth, really. And again, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be likable and wanting to have good relationships with people. You elevate it too high, it becomes unhealthy. The third one that we talk about is comfort. We allow comfort. We want the things in our lives we don't want to sacrifice. We don't ever want to be inconvenienced. We are willing to serve God up to a point, but as soon as it's going to make me uncomfortable, nah, I'm good. I'll go with you this far, and then I'm done. So again, there's nothing wrong with being comfortable, but when it becomes something that gets in the way of your relationship with God, it becomes an idol. And finally, we have, pulled a Rick Warren. Some of you political people thought that was funny. Some of you didn't. There it is, control. Control is the last one. I always get it confused with security, but really security becomes part of control. The reason that we want control is that we want everything to go the way so that nothing is going to surprise us. And so we have these 4 idols, and I think each one of us is kind of predisposed to struggle with one of those things. If I'm being transparent, mine is probably approval. I want you guys to like me. I don't know why. You guys aren't that great, but for some reason I want you to like me. It's counterproductive right there. But approval is my thing. I want to be liked by people. I don't like when people don't like me, and it just irks me, and it gets on my nerves. And so there's this approval is one of those things that if I'm not careful, I can elevate it above what God has asked me to do, and it becomes an idol. And so I think we see that in the foolish, the rich fool. His was security. His was control. He wanted to have enough that he could totally provide for himself and control his own situation. And so in the case of Yertle, I think we see power. He wants influence. He wants ambition. He wants all of it. And so we're going to get back to Yertle, because we're going to find out that those 4 things, if you pursue those things, you're going to find out ultimately, it may take a few years, it may take a few decades, but you're going to find that ultimately those things don't satisfy. You can chase them and chase them and chase them all your life, and you'll get them. You'll get them, and then you'll want more, and then when you get that, you're going to want more, and then when you get that, you're going to want more, and ultimately you'll never be satisfied chasing those things. And I think we're going to, again, go back to the great theologian, Dr. Seuss, to see some more of that. So we're going to jump back into the story where we left off. Yertle's now on 9 turtles, and he's got his cow and his mule. And it's funny to me, I'll get back to that. But we have 9 turtles, and again, he's going to be content now, except he's not. And so he decides that he wants more. And so he decides next he goes from 9 turtles to 200 turtles, which is just like, escalating rather quickly. But he goes from standing 9 turtles, he says, okay, I want a throne of 200 turtles. And so all of a sudden, they got 200 turtles stacked really, really high, and then he climbs up to the top, and now he can see all over the place. And so he picks up with 200 turtles, and he says, then Yertle the turtle was perched up so high, he could see 40 miles from his throne in the sky. Hooray, shouted Yertle, I'm the king of the trees. I'm the king of the birds, and I'm king of the bees. I'm king of the butterflies, king of the air. Ah, me, what a throne, what a wonderful chair. I'm Yertle the turtle, oh marvelous me, for I am the ruler of all that I see. And I'm struck by the idea that the things that he claims to be king of are not things he can actually control. He sees a cow in the distance and he says, oh, I'm king of that cow. That cow has no idea who Yertle is. He doesn't care. Now he's 40 miles up and he's like, oh, I'm king of the sky. I'm king of the wind and the trees. That tree is mine. That tree is mine. And so he starts claiming himself king over all this stuff, but he actually has nothing to show for it. And I think for us, it's the exact same way. When we chase after power, when we chase after approval, when we chase after comfort, when we chase after control, we feel like we have these things, but when it all boils down to it, they're like sand through our hands. We can't hold them. We have no control over them. They're there one minute, and then completely without our permission, they're gone the next. And so these things can't satisfy. And we're gonna see that with Yertle, is that now he's got all these things that he claims he's king of. He's the ruler of all of them. And like us, he holds on to these things, but he has no control over them. And so Yertle quickly finds this out, that one, what he has is temporary. It's illusory. But also that what he has is never enough, because once you have it, all you want is more. And so as he's sitting there 200 turtles high, it takes a long time, I guess, to create a tower of 200 turtles. That's fun to say. And so it takes a while, and so now it started to be evening, the moon has started to come out. And so now Yertle immediately says, wait, what's that thing? That thing's higher than me, and that's not right. He wants to be the absolute highest. Again, goes from being completely content to a pond, to excited about a cow and a mule, to now he can see pretty much everything there is to see, but because something is higher than him, he's not cool with it. And so he immediately starts rallying thousands of turtles. But what happens is way, 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 way down, 200 turtles down, the very bottom turtle is this little dude named Mac. And Mac has been straining because he's got 199 turtles on top of him. And they've been there all day. He's tired. He's exhausted. He's hungry. At several points in the story, if you read the full thing, he's called up to Yertle and asked for relief. And Yertle says, I'm not worried about you. I'm king of everything. And so Mac lets out, and it's funny because when this was published, this was so scandalous. So scandalous. Mac at the bottom lets out a burp. And at the time that this was written, it was one of the few times that the word burp had ever been published in a children's book. And it was scandalous that they actually wrote out the word burp. But he did. Mac, 200 turtles down, lets out a little burp. And this tiny little burp shakes everything that Yertle had created. This entire throne of turtles gets shaken all to the top, and it all comes crashing down. Something so small. Yertle, the king of everything that he could see, couldn't control one tiny burp from a turtle 200 below him. And so he immediately finds out that everything he thought he had built, everything he thought he had chased, everything he thought that he had collected for himself and was holding on to so tightly was never really his. He never really had it. It was never really there, and he had no control over it whatsoever. And so the final stanza of the story says, Yertle the turtle, the king of the trees, the king of the air and the birds and the bees, the king of a house and a cow and a mule. Well, that was the end of the Turtle King's rule. For Yertle, the king of all Salamasand, fell off his high throne and fell plunk in the pond. And today the great Yertle, that marvelous he, is king of the mud, for that's all he can see. And so I think the story, the message, the lesson from the story is pretty clear. It's simple, but it's also incredibly deep. Because we can say, okay, yeah, he wanted more, and then it all fell apart because you just aren't satisfied. He wasn't satisfied. But as soon as you turn that eternally and you start looking at yourself and say, okay, is that difficult for me? Am I able to say, okay, you know what, I'm content with what I have? Or are you constantly, you know what, I just need that one raise, or I just need that one promotion. Or maybe it's relationships, I just need to find the right person. Or maybe you're with the right person, you're like, I just need a little more commitment. Or maybe you have that and you're like, you know what, maybe just, we've been trying, we haven't been able to have kids. If we just had a kid, I know we'd be happy. There's always this, what is that? Oh, if only this. There's always something, there's a hole in us that we long to be filled. And so there's always this, if we just had this, we'd be content. If we just had this, we'd be content. If we just had the new car. Right now, if you guys, make sure you leave the parking lot before me, because right now when I start up my car, it makes this terrible, terrible, terrible noise for like about 30 seconds, and then it goes away, and then I can drive fine. But it's just this idea, oh, it's so easy for me. Man, if I just had a new car. Man, if someone would just fix my current car. Whatever it is, there's always this one thing, if I just had this, I'd be happy, I'd be content, I'd be fine. But like Yertle, we find that once we have that, there's always something else. Once we have the thing that we said, if we only had this, then there's a new thing. And so these things never satisfy, whether it's power, approval, control, comfort. We can chase these things, and for fleeting grasps we may have them, but they're temporary. And so the question then becomes, what is it then? How do we find our contentedness? Where does that come from? How can we get it? How can we look at our lives and say, you know what? If God brings more, that's fantastic, but I'm completely satisfied right here where I am, with the family that I have, with the paycheck that I have, with the job that I have, with the car that I have, with the TV that I have. That's another one that's really hard for me. As soon as I go to someone's house whose TV is bigger than mine, I come home and say, I need a new TV. There's nothing wrong with my TV. But if I go over to your house and you have a bigger one, I want one the size that you have. And so we have to learn to quit chasing those things that are fleeting and learn to pursue those things that will actually satisfy, that will actually bring contentedness. And so as we look at that, there's one more passage I want to look at in Scripture. This is, we're going from, if you're still in Luke, you're just going to go to the left a couple books. We're going to be going to the book of Matthew. It's another one of the Gospels that talks about Jesus' life, just written by a different person. And we're going to go to Matthew chapter 7. And we're going to pick up in verse 24. And I'm going to go ahead and call the band up while we're looking at this. And so Yertle created for himself this throne, this foundation of greed, of discontent, of a desire to have power at the expense of others. This is the foundation that he laid for himself, and it all came crashing down. And so once again, as I was reading through Dr. Seuss, I was reminded of a parable, a passage that Jesus had told. And so if you look in Matthew chapter 7, where did I say, verse 24, we have another parable that Jesus tells. And again, he's out teaching, and this is what he says starting in verse 24. He says, "Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Not unlike our Yertle. And so Jesus tells us what the foundation that we should be building our lives on is, and it's Him. We can seek those 4 idols. We can pursue them and pursue them and pursue them and get that hole filled momentarily. But again, either it comes crashing down, like the house that was built on the sand that had the poor foundation, or we get it and we're not satisfied, and so we just want more and more, and so we continue the cycle until it all comes crashing down. But Jesus says if you want a firm foundation, don't chase those things. I am your firm foundation. Instead of seeking all these other things to find contentedness, find that in me. And so if you're visiting with us, we have three rhythms that we say as a church that we feel like every person should have that shows that you're a healthy, growing follower of Christ. And that top one is really what we're talking about. It's this idea of healing in. Healing in is all about your relationship with Jesus, your one-on-one connection with Him, and asking Him to bring healing into your life. The holes that you have, to fill them. The wounds that you have, to heal them. The bondage that you're in, to free you. It's about finding all of that freedom and that health in your relationship with Christ. And the only way that happens is by choosing to follow Him and by pursuing that relationship. And so if you're unsure kind of how to do that or what that means, out here in the lobby, we have tables for each of these rhythms. We have a healing in table, we have a raising up table, we have a sending out table. And on that healing in table, we've got those guides. Again, if you've been with us for a while, you probably have snagged one at some point. But we have a guide that just talks about healing in, what it is, and what are some practices that if you're saying, you know what, my relationship with Christ isn't great. Or maybe you're saying, you know what, I don't know what a relationship with Christ means. I don't know what that means. And so I just want to find out more information. Stop by that table, grab one of those booklets. They say healing in on them. And it just talks about what that rhythm means and what different practices are that can help us grow and help us be more healthy in that area. Because ultimately, unless we are seeking Christ to bring fullness and contentment in our lives, if we're not doing that intentionally, then unintentionally we're going to start seeking those other four things. Because it's in our nature to drift away and do those things unless we're being intentional about pursuing Christ and wanting to grow in love for Him every day. And so that's my challenge as we close this morning. We're gonna close in worship. But ask yourself, what does it look like for you to pursue that relationship with Christ instead of those other four things? I think first we have to be honest and say, which of these four things do I struggle with? Because I think if you can sit there and say you don't struggle with any of those four things, either you should probably have my job instead of me, because that's not me, or you're not being honest with yourself. Everybody struggles with at least one of those four things. And so I think first it's being honest, what do I struggle with? And then say, how can I go to God and ask for help in that? And so I'm going to pray to close us out, and we're going to continue to worship, and just ask God to show you what it looks like, what it means to pursue Him with all your heart instead of pursuing those other things that are just going to lead to you being king of the mud one day. Let's pray together. Father God, we thank You for being a God who satisfies, a God who isn't here one day and gone the next like so many things that we would pursue in our lives, but someone who's always with us, and that You promise that if we seek You, we will find You, if we seek You with all our heart. And so that's my prayer for us this morning, that in every one of us, whether we've been walking with Christ for decades, whether we walked in here this morning and we have no idea of what it means to follow Christ and aren't even sure that we're interested, for every person in here, I know that You have them for a reason. And so I pray that in every one of us, You would create a passion for wanting to know You more day by day, for wanting to grow in our relationship with You as long as we've had that. And show us where in our lives we have blind spots. Where is it that we are slaves to the idols of power, of approval, of control, of comfort? Show us those ways that we fall short. Show us the ways that we try to find our contentment and our satisfaction in those things. And then we pray that You would help us, rather than pursue those, to turn our focus to You and find everything that we need, all the contentment, all the satisfaction, all the fulfillment, all the freedom, all the joy, everything that we have in a relationship with You, that You would bring that fully into our lives as we turn to You and say, Jesus, You are what I want. Pray this all in Your Son's name. Amen.